Okay, I was asked to introduce Vince Miller from the University of Kent, and I was talking to him beforehand, and I said, you know, if you could sum yourself up in a sentence, what would it be? There was some humming and hawing, and he said, technology skeptic. And many of you are working during your PhD on developing specific technologies and getting deeper and deeper, sometimes into holes, working on these specific ideas. And it's important now and again to think, where are you going? What happens if you're right? What happens if you make this work? And I think we're seeing more and more in computing, getting interesting input from other areas, from ethnomethodologists, from social scientists, from philosophers, making us think twice. What is, you know, what if we're right? What if we get this to work? What are the consequences? And that was one of the reasons we invited Vince to come and give a talk. And I shall let him take over in case I've continued to misrepresent his views.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me without the microphone by any chance?
You need it for the
Okay.
you're doing.
All right. Okay. Put it down. Better? Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to SIGSA for inviting me. In a way, inviting me to do this, I think, is a bit crazy. When I mentioned to my colleagues and my friends that I was going to be speaking, and indeed even opening a computing science conference, they laughed quite a lot, because first of all, their response was, "You don't know anything about computers, Vince." And that's true. I can't even update my own web page. And then the other point was, you know, what you do know about them, you don't seem to like. And I mean, that's not quite true, but it is, I guess, basically true that what I have written about has been quite critical in many respects of not necessarily technology itself, but the way it's used in contemporary society. So, yeah, in that respect, it should be an interesting conversation and an interesting couple of days for me anyway. So the question became, you know, what am I going to talk about in some senses that's going to be sort of familiar to people or interesting to people? I can't talk about software, so that's not going to happen. But basically, I'm going to talk a bit about, I suppose, what I do, which is look at how culture and technology kind of merge in some respects. And one thing that I have noticed lately, and that's my basic plan, but we don't need to go on with that. One thing that I've been noticing lately is that I haven't been completely alone in my sort of criticisms of technology lately. That there's been a recent sort of growing cottage industry of people who are becoming somewhat critical, particularly of digital culture and the internet and that kind of thing, both on the social science side and on the technology side. So, for example, people like Sherry Turkle, who I don't know if you may be familiar with her work or not, but she's an early sort of social scientist who was very much, you know, one of the first social scientists to research multi-user domains and that kind of thing, and very, you know, very sort of ebullient about them in a way. And of course, she's come out with a book. Her recent book came out last year, Alone Together, and she's actually sort of talked in a sense about how technology has taken a wrong turn in some senses. In Alone Together, she basically says that we you know, increasingly use technology to distance ourselves from the emotional needs of other people, while at the same time expanding the number of relationships that we can maintain. And I'll go into her work in a bit more detail in a second. We've also got Evgeny Morozov, who in his recent book, The Net Delusion, is basically a sort of a critique of cultural utopianists who suggest that networking technology sort of necessarily leads to more freedom in society. And he actually suggests the opposite, that such technologies tend more often to abolish freedom than to enhance it. So again, going against the sort of previous sort of technological utopian grain. And lastly, more of a technical person, Jaron Lanier, who's quite big in sort of VR studies and things like that. And he's been, his recent book, You're Not a Gadget. I mean, he complains a lot about a lot of different things in terms of digital culture, but what I want to focus on here is a suggestion that digital technology is promoting a reductionist model of human affairs. And in a sense, and he's quite dramatic about it in a way. You know, he says it's almost destroying individuality and personhood in a way. So within sort of academic or pseudo-academic circles, there's this developing sort of, I suppose, criticism of digital culture and how we use technology, mobile phones and the internet. Now, in popular culture, there seems to be a bit more of a concern, in a sense, with how people behave online and through digital technologies. I'm much more concerned with, I've read phrases like the dark side of the internet and this kind of thing. And, you know, this has been, you know, largely focused around criticisms of social media in terms of things like cyberbullying, trolling, as well as concerns with things like privacy. And the debate seems to be opening up as to whether or not, for example, anonymity on the internet is something that should be kept or something that should be gotten rid of in a way, in an attempt to sort of get rid of antisocial behavior on the internet. And I'm not going to go too much into cyberbullying, but, you know, for example, Beat Bullying UK has come up with, you know, these statistics that, for example, in terms of school-age children, almost a third of them are being bullied through digital technologies, and quite surprisingly, 1 in 10 teachers are being bullied by their students through digital technologies and these kinds of things. And so that made the headlines a little bit, and, you know, there have been many stories like the one involving Claudia Bohner, who basically appeared, she was a German model who appeared on this sort of German version of Come Dine With Me, and after her appearance there, she was basically bullied through Twitter to the point where she killed herself, quite sadly. So, you know, those sorts of things have been going on. Similarly, there's, you know, discussions around flaming, although people talk less about flaming now as they've adopted this sort of cyberbullying discourse a bit more. But one thing in particular that's really captured the imagination is trolling, right? You know, the last 6 months in particular, the popular press has really sort of seized upon this concept of the troll as, you know, the sort of almost the embodiment of what's wrong with the internet in a way. And of course, here you have Sean Duffy, who was recently jailed, you know, and he's photographed, you know, as the face of the internet troll, beware, sort of thing, right? And, you know, very much, you know, it's capturing this seeming sort of public concern with how people behave and what people do. And I mean, I was kind of interested in how much of this is media hype, so I actually went on a couple of our memorial websites on Facebook. And so, for example, and it's quite sad really, but you see these, you do see comments like, you know, Georgia was a beautiful young girl, she would be missed dearly. It's such a shame to lose her. Everyone who knew her said she was an amazing person. To all you trolls, fuck off, you low-life pieces of shit. Excuse my language. But the point is, there obviously must be a problem for somebody to write that on the page. You know, these things do happen. They're not necessarily really rare, isolated events. And, you know, not to focus on the macabre, but you've also had story, and I do get more optimistic later on, so, you know. I don't want to talk about suicide for the entire talk, that's for sure. But, you know, there have been other recent stories which have been come out and sort of, you know, made it into sort of the public domain in terms of, you know, shocking events. So, for example, Christmas Day 2010, a social worker called Simone Bach posted a status update that basically said, "Took all my pills, beads dead soon, bye-bye everyone." And I suppose the interesting thing about this is Simone had 1,082 friends on Facebook, some of which who lived within walking distance of her flat, and nobody did anything. In fact, what did happen is some people did take the time, not to call the police, but to make sort of disparaging comments on her Facebook site, or question the sincerity of the suicide attempt. But as you can see through some of the, you know, discussion here, a debate opens up about her sincerity and about, really, you know, it becomes a very, almost an intellectual engagement with somebody who's obviously going through some serious problems. And it wasn't until 17 hours later that her mother received a text message about the status update, and the police were eventually called. And, you know, unfortunately, it was a sincere attempt. And similarly, you had similar stories around, for example, Abraham Biggs in the States, who in November 2008, who committed suicide live on Justin TV after posting his intentions on one chat room and his suicide note on another. And this was witnessed by 1,500 people, right? And again, nobody called the police or anything like that or tried to dissuade him, and instead they encouraged him through the act and berated him and that kind of thing. And it became quite a spectacle of cruelty in a number of respects. And it wasn't until several hours later, after he had been motionless, that eventually the police were called. And similar things have happened in Britain. People going on, getting goaded into suicides through insult chat rooms and things like that. And apparently, anyway, these things have been happening. Shocking. And in many respects, there have been like increased calls for legislation around these kind of shocking events. For the government to increasingly try to legislate people's behavior on the internet. Several US states now, for example, like Arizona, are trying to enact anti-trolling laws. A couple of people, such as Sean Duffy, have been arrested in the UK in the last year for basically trolling behavior. And there's also been increased pressure on sites like Facebook and Google to do more to intervene in people's, for example, searching habits when it comes to Google, or their behavior when it comes to Facebook, try to curb antisocial behavior and that sort of thing. And this has been met largely with reluctance by these sites, and that reluctance is understandable because one of the perceived strengths of the web is its liminality, right? The web is always supposed to have been a place that's sort of beyond the limitations of everyday life, where you have freedom of identity, freedom of speech, freedom of debate. It's a place where people feel unencumbered by modes of convention, of politeness, of authority, sexuality, and even crime. But in the last few years, we've entered a bit of a problem here in that obviously the internet has become increasingly enmeshed in everyday life. It's become a major part of normal society, for lack of a better word. So, our social interactions on many levels are increasingly mediated through these technologies and through the web. And people ask people out on the internet, through text messages and things like that. People break up, they do their business in these sort of contexts. They keep in touch with friends. So it's become part of civil society. So we really need to think about the society that we're creating here, because it's not really a liminal space anymore. It's not necessarily a free-for-all, where people can do whatever it is they want to do. And, or maybe it still is, but should it be? And these are, questions that are obviously being asked in many contexts, around contexts of antisocial behavior, privacy, and that kind of thing. So what's going on? Like, why is there so much antisocial behavior? Psychology has looked a lot into the relationship between antisocial behavior and sort of digital technologies and communication systems for quite a while, since the late 80s at least. And it's kind of, it's been curious about, why do people flame and these kinds of things. And between psychology and sort of public perception, usually the first port of call is the concept of anonymity. All right? The idea that because people aren't known, they have no consequences. They don't face any consequences for their actions, so they can do whatever they want to do. I find this pretty simplistic. For example, I think Mark Zuckerberg said a few months ago, the idea of an anonymous web is probably going to be a thing of the past and all this, and maybe that'll curb antisocial behavior. I don't think it will. It'll have an impact, but ultimately this is a very simplistic explanation, because it assumes, first of all, that people are inherently jerks, and if they don't face any consequences for their actions, then they'll be jerks. No, that's not true, because obviously people are very nice on the internet, by and large. People do good things in anonymous contexts. eBay is a great example. You're anonymous on eBay, you kind of have to be, right? And but people are very pleasant on eBay, overly so, I would say, in many respects. Second Life, again, anonymous, but generally people's behavior is pretty cordial. And even think about things like voting and stuff like that, right? In wider society, the use of anonymity doesn't necessarily mean that people become radicalized. In fact, if you look at anonymous voting behavior, people are quite conservative when they vote. So I don't think it's just about anonymity. Better psychologists will talk about the concept of, they'll go beyond simple anonymity and talk about de-individuation, right? In which individuals who are usually involved in groups that involve a certain degree of anonymity sometimes lose their sense of individuality. And thus they lose their sense of personal responsibility for their actions. And in this kind of context, they're less likely to lose their inhibitions and engage in behavior that may otherwise be a bit unlikely for them to engage in. And again, it's kind of interesting to think about social media in that respect. But again, I think it has the same sort of simplistic sort of arguments that simple anonymity has. And I've been interested in looking at this through a slightly more sort of, I suppose, deeper cultural lens, really, and philosophical lens. And, you know, I mean, I think that this is a cultural and a technological problem, right? Because it's about how we exist in the world and how we approach the world and how we approach other people, right? And, you know, I mean, networking technologies have helped really to change this. It's changed how we exist in the world. It's changed how we relate to things, you know, it's expanded our social horizons in many respects. So I've been looking at this through the concept of presence. And when I'm talking about presence, I'm not just talking, or indeed I talk a bit about a crisis of presence in contemporary society, but I'm not just talking about proximity. And as you can see from these definitions here, you know, presence is more than just being about proximity. There's, you know, the state of being present or existence or occurrence, which is, you know, a much larger sort of idea of being in a sense. The second one, of course, is more the idea of immediate proximity. The third definition, the idea of influence or power. So, you know, for example, you know, you feel supernatural presence, or you know, America has a presence in NATO or something like that. There's that sense of presence. There's also the idea of a presence as in your presence is requested at a certain thing. It's a sort of outdated mode of the idea of assembly or company. And then, while I was looking up definitions, because I like definitions, being a sort of a cultural studies kind of person, I came across the idea of real presence, which is a bit of an archaic term. And it refers to the doctrine that the body of Christ is actually present in the Eucharist. And I found this interesting because I've run across this before when I've been reading different sort of philosophical texts and texts about digital culture as well. So real presence, right, basically goes back to the argument that occurred in the early Reformation, right, that the body, the wine and the bread involved in the sacraments of the Eucharist that Catholics will be familiar with, literally transforms itself into the body and blood of Christ. All right? So that's what Catholics still believe, and that's what all Christians believed up until the Reformation. And one of the big issues in the Reformation was this idea that, no, this isn't a literal transformation. It doesn't really become the body and blood of Christ. It symbolically becomes the body and blood of Christ. All right? And this was a huge argument, because Catholics basically said, no, that's not good enough. You can't have a virtual presence. That kind of means nothing. If the sacraments are supposed to mean something, Christ has to literally be there in body, right? And really, I mean, this is actually, I think, quite an interesting thing, because when we think about this idea of a virtual presence not being good enough, this was a debate that was had centuries ago, and reemerges again when people talk about things like internet communities. Are they real communities? You know, love on the internet. Well, it can't be real love. You know, you don't meet the people, right? You know, so there is this question about what does it mean? How important is it to be physically present somewhere? And how does that affect things? I'll just grab a little water here. So, presence and its relationship to the virtual and to the way we sort of treat ourselves and treat each other is quite important. And you're probably going to get something here that you didn't expect to get, which is a couple of slides on the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. So we'll see how that goes. Heidegger, in the early 20th century, was very much focused on this idea of presence and being, right? He saw this as the primary task of philosophy, right? And particularly important because he thought that Western culture had really abandoned the notion of being. It had misunderstood what being was. And he said that this was a legacy of classical Greek philosophy, mostly Plato and Aristotle. And that philosophy, those two philosophers in particular, suggested that knowledge of the world is achieved pretty much exclusively on the basis of reason, right, of thinking about the world. And this, Heidegger said, means two things. First of all, that what you get in that sort of philosophical move to being as thinking is you get this idea that you have an orientation towards the world that's centered around a mind or a spirit or a psyche, right? So it's something that sets itself apart from the world, right? And apart from the material, apart from your body, apart from the things in the world. And then secondly, that the things of this world become something for that sort of mind or psyche to think about. So things in the world stop to have their own sort of inherent meanings. Instead, we start to give these things meanings, right? And we tend to do this in a very sort of practical way. So the things in the world have no intrinsic meaning, but are encountered as things that, in a sense, these disembodied sort of minds or psyches see as useful, right? So, in a sense, we've got two things. We've got the mind that's considered, in this essence of being a human, as being something that's apart from the world, and then something that views the world as a bunch of objects that are useful to it, in a way. So, in a sense, the Western mode of being, Heidegger argued, was one of alienation from the world, because we see ourselves as present to the world, but kind of separate from it at the same time. As I say there's this sort of emphasis on a separation of the intellectual, mental, or spiritual subject from the material world around it. And I won't read through this because it'll probably take too much time. But yeah, and arguably, this is the sort of state that we kind of achieve online in many respects, a kind of a disembodied thing that sort of views different images and stuff like that. So what we find later on during the past the Reformation and into the Renaissance, we find a rediscovery, of course, historically, of the classical Greek tradition in philosophy. This is rediscovered in the Renaissance, and so this way of thinking about being and presence in the world becomes solidified again through the work of philosophers like René Descartes, right, who again focused the entirety of being in the concept of a thinking or a rational mind, right? So when Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," what he's doing is he's separating the thinking subject as something prior to the world and separate from the world of objects around it. So thus we have what would be considered the metaphysical basis of modern philosophy. And again, the reason I brought up the real presence in the Eucharist is that same sort of idea is, you can have a kind of a thought of Christ being present in the Eucharist. He doesn't actually have to be there. So the metaphysical basis of modern philosophy, the idea that human existence is grounded in thought. There's a dissociation between human existence and space, and the dissociation between human existence and substance. So Heidegger then, later on in his life, started to talk about the relationship that we have with technology. And this is where technology starts to come in a little bit. So Heidegger suggested that this alienation from the world becomes more significant with industrialization and the advent of modern technology, right? Because it enhances this kind of rational, calculative, instrumental way of encountering the world, right? So it kind of encourages our Western cultural bias towards instrumentalism, right? So we've developed a mode of being with technology and after industrialization where the world and nature is what he called set upon, right? So nature, in a sense, ceases to become something that's worked with, right? It becomes, aggressively transformed through technologies into things that are useful. And in a sense, nature has to prove itself to be useful, has to, in a sense, sit there as what he called a standing reserve for our use, right? So really, how we encounter the world in a sort of a technological mode of being is as something that can be exploited. So here, for example, he talks about, the Rhine River, right? Which becomes, in a sense, part of the provision of electricity. That's how it's seen. It gets corralled into a dam, and in a sense, as he says here, rather the river is dammed up into the power plant. What the river is now, namely a water power supplier, derives from out of the essence of the power station. So, this is how we view the world. We view the world as resources to be exploited. And he says that this is, in a sense, the legacy of that particular mode of being that goes all the way back to Plato. Now, sorry. He goes one step further from this, though, to suggest that this cultural tendency combined with this sort of technological way of being ends up inframing our social relation as well. So the point is, inframing isn't something we just do to the world, but it's something we end up doing to each other. Right? People become more objectified, and humanity itself starts to be seen increasingly as a resource. And this is ironic, of course, because the whole point about technologies was to give us some sort of mastery over nature and that kind of thing. But instead, what's happened is it's sort of turned backwards, and that humanity, in a sense, has become inframed by technology, and in a sense, turned itself into a resource that can be exploited. And bringing this into the modern age, or the contemporary age, and looking at Sherry Turkle's work, who I mentioned earlier, you see these kind of notions of inframing in a lot of the interviews and a lot of the work that she's done. So here she says, networked we are together, but so lessened are our expectations of each other that we can feel utterly alone. There is the risk that we come to see each other as objects to be accessed, and only for the parts we find useful, comforting, or amusing. Right? So, her argument within this book is that we use technology to maintain useful connections to other people and expand our social relationships. And obviously, we get a kind of a ubiquitous networked presence from doing that. But her argument is that what's happened is that we've become overwhelmed by the amount of communication that we have to engage in to maintain this expanded set of relationships. All right? So the result is that we need to be ever more efficient in these interactions, and we become dependent on technology to maintain them. And ultimately, this efficiency means a kind of a distance from other people and a distraction from, for example, what we're doing at the time. So one of our interviewees says, it's also that I don't want to talk to people now. I don't want to be interrupted. I think I should want it. It would be nice, but it's easier to deal with people on my BlackBerry, right? And this, in a sense, becomes the essence of Turkle's argument in this book, is that people, make demands. They become difficult to deal with. So we use technology to, in a sense, set ourselves apart from them and only deal with them in very sort of constrained ways. And it also means that because of all these demands, we don't have attention focused on anything in particular. We're not focused on, for example, the here and now, because we're also busy texting or checking our emails and doing that kind of thing. So even when we are really present somewhere, we still have a kind of networked, disembodied presence to all these other relationships that we have to maintain at the same time. So her argument is that we use technology, in a sense, to keep a kind of an emotional distance away from people, to keep things scripted, right? To avoid awkwardness or unpredictability or intimacy even. So, in a sense, she's saying that we're investing more and expecting more in technology than we are of other people, right? So, for example, we don't, some research from somebody else, sort of backs us up in a way, right? People avoid phone calls because phone calls you have to deal with the unpredictability of other people. You're going to get involved in a conversation. Who has time for that, right? When you text, boom, you can get a message across and not have to deal with anything, right? Want to break up with somebody? Text them. That way, you avoid the awkwardness of hurting other people's feelings, right? Want to ask somebody out but don't really want to put yourself out there and make yourself vulnerable? Send them an email. Would you like to go out sometime? Yeah. And then if they say no, slough it off, doesn't matter, right? And, she sort of goes further to say that this kind of emotional distance means that people are increasingly insensitive to the sort of emotional needs of others, right? And so you get scenarios where small sort of discussions become huge arguments, you know, that go out of control on Facebook or, you know, on email discussions, that kind of thing, where, you know, everybody, a big argument seems to come from nothing. There's no sense of perspective, you know, and you get more flaming, more bullying, more of these kinds of things because people are increasingly using this sort of technological distance and thus becoming a bit more insensitive to the needs of other people. So, Tyrrell's kind of suggesting that one of the main problems here is that we're always elsewhere. Even when we are physically in some spot, we're mentally somewhere else. You know, our social and physical presence, I suppose, aren't the same. So the question is, does it really matter where we are? And, you know, in terms of how we treat each other? And probably, unsurprisingly, my answer is probably yes. And there's a tradition of this that goes way back to, again, Aristotle, who in the Nicomachean Ethics said, sufferings are pitiable when they appear to be close at hand, right? And, you know, his argument in that was that you can have an abstract principle of ethics and justice that's sort of the same everywhere. And that's all well and good, and he called that natural justice. But natural justice gives way to what he called conventional justice, right? Justice that is particular, you know, particular legal regimes, particular contexts, particular spatial situations. And that's, in a sense, the one that counts in many respects. And, you know, I mean, later philosophers like Adam Smith, for example, you know, famous Scottish philosopher, who wrote the theory of moral sentiments, said a similar thing. He said the physical presence of others is indispensable in moral behavior, right? Because we have the mirror afforded to us by the eyes of other people, right? And this helps us reflect upon ourselves and our own actions. So without this kind of looking glass of seeing ourselves in the gaze of others, without that present, we risk becoming overly selfish, which is one reason why he said that capitalism was a good thing, because it meant that we had to experience more strangers and things like that, and ultimately that keeps checks on our moral behavior. And similarly, the sort of 20th century ethical philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, right, went further to suggest that ethics are born out of the concrete, embodied level of person-to-person contact. That's where ethics occurs and ethical behavior occurs. Because the presence of the other, in the form especially of the face, makes demands upon us to react to them and to behave ethically towards them. So for example, if you're out on a Friday night and you see somebody coming down the street, a job or something like that, and he knocks over a garbage can, you might sort of disapprove of it, but you'll walk on, carry on with your life. If in that same incident, they knock over a person, and as you walk by, you know, you lock eyes with that person, and they look up at you, you know, and essentially they're saying, help me. You feel obliged to do something, and if you don't do anything, you feel terrible walking away, right? So, Levinas's point is that the face of another instills a responsibility in us to behave ethically. Essentially, faces say, do not hurt me, or do not kill me. Now, so it's in this sort of proximal, embedded, or embodied encounter, which creates the possibility for ethical behavior. So, in that respect, physical faces, are important. But what happens when that face is mediated? Well, for social theorists and sociologists, going back, you know, when studying when mass media was first coming out, the argument generally seems to be that mediated faces, especially the faces of strangers, lose their embodied presence. All right? So looking at a picture of a face is not the same as looking at a real face. So these faces, mediated faces, only present aesthetics, right? And this, in a sense, allows them to become open to be experienced as objects, and objects of enjoyment, right? So they can be denied a moral compulsion and can be encountered as objects in purely instrumental terms. And so, you know, I mean, writers such as Luc Boltanski here, right, have suggested, particularly with broadcast media, that what contemporary society suffers from is a crisis of pity, where, you know, we see the suffering of others on televisions and things like that around the world and that kind of thing, but we don't really do that much about it, right? We're able to sort of disengage from it because we've adopted the stance of a spectator, right? So we've got a presence there. We're present to that suffering, that incident, whatever, but we're not present with it. We're not present with them. And that's a difference. It's a moral and an ethical difference. So, of course, with new media, this poses a bit of a problem because we sort of inherit this disengaged spectator position, but at the same time, we now have a capacity for direct action. It's not just broadcast media, and we have a capacity for direct contact and influence over others, right? So there's an ethical gap between the sort of spectator and the participant, in a way. And, you know, as a result, people can flame, people can witness suicides, people can do all the things that I talked about early on. As a spectator, as somebody who's present to something and enjoying the other person kind of as an object, and not as a person with an inherent intrinsic meaning in their own right. So, computing science. We got there eventually. ICTs have helped to expand the social world beyond everything that we've seen before, and in ways we've struggled to cope with, and I think we are still struggling to cope with. You know, it's definitely changed our presence in the world, and thus our being in it, and how we relate to people and objects around us. As a society, we face a potential problem in that digital technology gives us a presence beyond the embodied and the face-to-face in a very direct way, in an instantaneous way. But, as I've tried to suggest, and it's arguable, I suppose, but our ethics generally are based in the idea of an embodied, physical, face-to-face presence. So, digital culture at the moment seems to be pushing through what Heidegger called the metaphysics of presence. And this, in a sense, risks further objectifying the world and the people in it. But this is not necessarily inevitable, even though we can maybe see this problem manifest in increasing concerns over things like privacy, bullying, all this antisocial behavior and all that kind of stuff. It's not necessarily inevitable. So if we look at Jaron Lanier's book, You're Not a Gadget, you know, he sees that this isn't necessarily inevitable. This isn't what technology is going to do to us. But right now he thinks that's what it is doing to us, mostly because of things like software and the limitations of standard operating systems and sets of software, which we keep building upon in digital culture. So, I mean, implicit in his critique is the idea that if we can change the software, we can make a difference. We can start to come up with ways where people are objectified less. But at the moment, his critique is that, you know, software such as, he's got a problem with Unix, he's got a problem with MIDI. I'm not going to go into those because you guys will know a lot more about that than I will. But I mean, and you know, a lot of the sort of collectively produced software, social media, these kinds of things, he suggests, are having a profound effect at the moment on human affairs and interaction. And he sees the current structure of social media in particular as reductivist, constraining individual representation and expression into pre-formatted options which conform to templates. And he argues that this reduces people to essentially sources of fragments, and forces people to define themselves, for example, through external objects. So you think of like the limitations of Twitter. What can you say about yourself in, what is it, 140 characters? Not that much. But people are very clever in using Twitter in interesting ways, but it's always about, in a sense, providing an external link to something else. So the definition of you as a person, or you as a profile person, becomes links to external objects and things like that, because you're constrained in how much you can express yourself as an individual. So as a result, he argues, we lose the individual person, who gets reduced to categories of data. Presumably these categories of data will be sold as well, but that's another story. And we're all forced to interact with each other through these very limiting and constraining software regimes. Again, this arguably is reminiscent of Heidegger's notion of inframing. What was once supposed to help us take command of relationships has instead set upon those relationships and objectified them. So, the challenge for computing scientists, or at least, I don't know, maybe things I'd like to see, is another way to put that. If ethics is based in embodied co-presence, how can we improve the digital encounter with others? How can we reassert the body or the face in different forms of digital interactions? How can we rediscover the embodied human in digital interactions and a sense of co-presence as opposed to spectatorship? How can we encourage and create non-reductivist social software design that allows for more individual creativity and expression to reflect more of the qualitative aspects of the person as opposed to the quantitative categories of the objects? To paraphrase Lanier's critique of MIDI, how can we represent the sort of varying musical nuances and notes of the violin as opposed to the tableted, rigid notes of the piano? Presumably he's saying that people are more like violins than pianos and should be treated as such. And as a last point, my colleague, actually, David Boothroyd at the University of Kent, has been using Levinas in many respects, writing about similar things. And he sees the idea of haptic technologies and the development of haptic technologies as a form of embodied encounter which can be manifested through technology at long distances, and perhaps has the same potential to create a sense of embodiment and proximity that can form the basis of ethical encounters through technology. And maybe this is another way of being optimistic. And that's me. Thank you.
So, questions? We're keen to get some interaction from the audience in all of these cases, so this is your chance to ask some questions.
A couple of questions. First of all, is there actually any data that demonstrates that people meet up less because we have Facebook and Twitter than they did before that?
No, I wouldn't say that it's not necessarily about meeting up less. I mean, in many respects, digital technology can encourage meetings. But I think part of the point that Turkle was making, and evidence in her qualitative research, is that even when people meet up, they're not really meeting up because they are kind of elsewhere as well. They are checking their emails, they're texting, they're doing these things, so they're always distracted and somewhat distant. People don't focus attention on people in the same way that they used to, if that makes sense.
It's an assertion. Yeah, I'm not sure how well it's been demonstrated. I'm not sure how easy, it would be almost impossible to demonstrate, in the sense that we don't have the data from what people did without these technologies. You know, they may have spent the time looking out the window.
No, I mean, that's true. I mean, and again, with any form of sort of social theoretical criticism, there's always going to be the, well, how do you compare the past with the present sort of argument, and it is difficult in that respect. And I mean, one of the things that I plan to do after dealing with some of this theory is to try and formulate a kind of a more empirical project which looks at sort of people's engagements with each other in those kind of contexts, to see whether, to provide evidence for that or to refute it.
Okay, my other comment was about Lanier's point about people being constrained by the technologies. How does, I haven't read his book, how does he discuss the blogosphere within that? Because what that seems to me to have done is actually empowered people to express themselves in a way which was absolutely impossible before. So they're not constrained at all, it's quite the opposite. So it does appear to contradict that notion that people be put into templates. In fact, that the technology is liberating it, because the ability to communicate was in the hands of an elite before that.
Can I start with my answer to that before I get on to Lanier's?
Sure.
One paper I wrote recently actually was looking at, let's go back a few years, right, to the sort of mid-1990s, when teenagers had blogs, and that's what they all did. Blogging was the trendy thing to do. Everybody had blogs and that kind of thing, and that's what they did. Then, of course, the next fad that came along was, I suppose, MySpace, in a sense, which slightly was a bit more templated, but still provided plenty of room for personal expression in many respects for young people, and then, indeed older people as well. And then from MySpace, we went to Facebook, which is very templated and very much a sort of multiple choice kind of description of yourself in many respects. And Lanyon, in his book, actually makes a similar point that we used to have personal web pages, which were all about, personal expression and gave a lot of freedom for people to do that, right? But as time has gone on, everybody's piled more into social networking and done that instead, and sort of put up with the increasing strains on their sort of individual ways of expressing themselves and that kind of thing. Now, when it comes to blogs, Lanyon is actually quite cynical about the blogosphere in many respects, mostly not necessarily related to that sort of lack of individual expression. Like I said, he's got many critiques in the books, and I'm just focusing on that one because it fits in with what I'm saying. But in terms of the blogosphere, his point is that basically people's individual expression gets completely lost in the amount of stuff that's out there, the amount of blogs and that kind of thing.
Not to them, it doesn't. That's a ridiculous assertion. In fact, it doesn't mean if people want to express themselves in their blogs, and again, the evidence that people move from blogs to MySpace to Facebook, again, I think is lacking in the sense that we're still seeing an increase in the number of people with blogs. I don't know whether they're the same people or if there's a difference, but making these kind of assertions without actually turning to the evidence, and which are contradicted by the evidence, it seems to be a very dubious thing to do.
Well, I think one of the points is that if a million people have blogs and you're trying to pay attention to all these people, and this would be something that Turk was saying as well, ultimately nobody pays attention to any of it. I mean, the one reason that Facebook...
But nobody pays attention to a million anything, of course that's right. But if 20 people have blogs and you pay attention to them, you can pay attention to them.
Well, I'm not going to sit here and defend Lanyon on that particular point, but I would say read the book and see what you think about it there. I'm using him in a very specific context here, which is more about his critique of the software as opposed to the blogging thing. But read the book. It's interesting.
One of Lanyon's comments was about the MIDI standard for audio and how it was developed for a specific reason, but then because it became a standard, it was then used in lots of ways which actually limited the expressiveness of electronic music, and it wasn't because the guy who invented the standard had planned it for that, but because it became a standard, it ended up being used, although there were much better possibilities later on because it had been a standard. So I guess that was ties in with some of what we were...
Yeah, the whole idea of lock-in in that respect, he saw as quite damaging in many respects, and that people should be more
Actually, it's damaging to an elite. Perhaps the elite of people who actually care about these things, but actually it's liberating to a much broader community who can actually then create electronic music because of the standard. They're not ever going to be a member of that elite, they're never going to be fantastic musicians, but they get the pleasure of doing it.
I guess you've still got the issue of whether you're creating glass ceilings, which now could have been done. We could come up with better things now, which would be easy to start.
That's an argument for all standards. That's nothing to do with MIDI. That's every standard is a constraint.
Any other questions? Question?
I think that I do agree with some of the assertions. It's probably more difficult to get people's attention because a smartphone is more attractive than a technology. It won't be technology. If something else that will be more attractive than a window, people will get distracted.
No, I agree. I said at the outset that I don't have a problem with technology itself. It is a cultural problem, right? Obviously technology does great things, but technology is used in specific ways by cultures, and if you have a culture that is already moving in a direction which, to a certain extent, can be argued, as sometimes being a bit destructive towards, objectifying people, behaving, exploiting them, that kind of thing. Technology can be used to assist that. And so, my whole point about bringing Lanyon in the first place was basically to say, you know, that technology can also be used to maybe resist that as well. And instead of going along with it, maybe, you know, if we start to rethink about technology and software and try and make it a bit more inventive, a bit more expressive of the person, and, you know, a bit, you know, in terms of people's social interactions as well, is a bit more rich, and for me, a bit more embodied and a bit more proximal, then that can hopefully assist in the situation and not contribute to it.
Any more questions?
How do you plan to go on? Or do you have ideas of how this embodiment would be realized?
Well, I'm not a technical person, so I think, you know, it's the job of you know, sociologists and cultural studies people to maybe point things out, some of which may have more evidence than others. Sometimes they're just philosophical points. In a way, I'm saying I kind of place faith in people like yourself to maybe, you know, if you agree with the idea that things are maybe becoming a bit too objectified in digital culture, to try and come up with ways. You know, for example, like I said, my colleague Dave Boothroyd seems very interested in the ethical promise of haptic work and haptic technologies, that kind of thing. You know, it's just ways of being inventive around how to get the human back in a lot of digital interactions, which some people argue is starting to be eroded a bit.
To me, one thing that was missing was the link with economics in here, because these are, I mean, Facebook is not something that just happens. It's a multi-billion-dollar company, and people invest in these because obviously Facebook can deliver to them something. And a major drive why you may want to categorize people in a, you know, kind of multiple choice fashion is that is what we would say a very effective way of extracting features out of people. But for free text, it's extremely difficult to do that. So, you know, that's another level at which the technology could, it's quite possible that some bits of computing technologies are not yet there to enable a more rounded human participation in the social networks. And to some extent, you know, that's also something to consider when you think about how these things evolve. You know, there's an economic driver because they're companies that want to make money. How can they make money? They have to extract features from people. How to extract features, so they make the people extract themselves the features and objectify themselves.
Yeah, exactly. I agree completely. And to be honest, I mean, I think that is something that's missing out of Lanier's critique a bit as well. But yeah, I mean, that's why I tried to make the point about trying to extract the qualitative aspects of the person as opposed to the quantitative aspects of the object. Because yeah, the ultimate drive, if it's to make money, is to produce a saleable object, which in this case would be data. And this is, for example, why we have issues around privacy and these kinds of things, because that data is worth something.
Right, but of course at the economics level, the regulation may be more important. It's very hard to legislate against individuals' behaviors, but it's probably easier to legislate on the drivers.
Yeah, no, and I think, you know, of the whole issue around privacy and what information is extracted and what's done with it, I mean, I do think that's an ethical issue as well, because it is ultimately how, again, relating to how people are treated, how people treat people. Right? And if they are treated as merely categories of data and essentially objectified, then it's easy to invade people's privacy. It's easy to sort of sell on information about them.
Yeah, quick question about the social interaction discussion. Doesn't the culture of an online place dictate its function, or maybe vice versa, the function dictates the culture of a place, and hence the social interaction that you were saying before? You're saying about all these teenagers and suicide and all about Anonymous or whatever. And I'm thinking now, like, you were talking before about blogs, right? Blogs have a completely different function than Facebook. And Facebook has a completely different function than what MySpace used to have, right? So there is like this transition, but people have like, for example, using blogs or using social sites like Reddit, which, you know, like have different interactions, you know, like than other, like, I don't know, forums that were people being anonymous.
Hmm.
Right. So I don't know. I suppose that the differentiation is needed between how people react in different, like, I don't know how to call it, like in different technology or different platforms, rather than putting them all together and saying all are bad, all are good, or all dictate the next behavior or take the Y behavior. Does it make sense to you? Does it,
yeah, no, I would, yeah, and they're not all the same. I think there's a functional thing. And to be honest, I mean, in my writing, I've been quite positive about blogs, right? I mean, I think everybody should blog instead of be on Facebook, for example, because I do think it's a better form of expression. But I think there's a functionalist problem in there as well. You know, for example, people talk about internet communities, and you know, people go onto these communities because they have certain interests, right? And they maintain these things, and they're, you know, they're very sort of cordial and pleasant because people are getting something out of them, right? You know, there's a function, you know, it's, an internet community based around, I don't know, film critique or VW owners or something like that. And certainly a lot of early literature, social science literature was, you know, oh, isn't this wonderful? You know, internet communities are superior in many respects because, you know, they have a purpose and they have a function and people get what they want out of them and everybody's getting something out of it. And in a way, I mean, I could see that, but in a way it is a form of instrumentalism as well. It is human interactions with people merely for the point of getting what you want to get out of them. You know what I mean? So it is another form of instrumental behavior in a way that, for example, a real world community isn't, because you're stuck together, you don't have a choice. You have to respect people's, you know, opinions. When my neighbors tell me that I have to trim my hedge and mow my lawn, right? I can't just quit and move. Well, I could, but it would be a pain. Instead, I have to acknowledge that they you know, have certain rights and certain interests. So my relationship with them is not particularly instrumental. In fact, they're a burden to me in many respects, because maybe I don't want to trim my hedge. You know, maybe I got other more interesting things to do, but I have to do that. And that's, in a sense, part of being in a co-present community with people, is you have to deal with people who are unlike yourself and have different demands, and you have to sort of deal with them as individual humans with, you know, senses of respect, not merely in a kind of an instrumental fashion of, well, we get, you know, we're all getting something out of it.
but are the norms, like are the social norms that we have right here, right now, for example, and are different from online norms depending the community that we examine?
Yeah, but I mean, I think, you know, as more of our lives are kind of lived online, and the more we interact with other humans through digital technologies, it's, I would say that's the problem, is we've got online norms and then we've got everyday life norms, and right now they're not particularly meshing. You know, so I think it's A, worth pointing that out, but also B, worth investigating how we can perhaps make them mesh a bit more, because it's going to happen, right? And, you know, within the real world, we have concepts of politeness, of civil society, and these kinds of things. Online, it's not the same. You know, it's still seen as a kind of a liminal space, and that's, I think, going to be a problem in the future.
One thing that a lot of people like about internet communities is that you can choose how you, what you present, what you reveal about yourself. Do you think we're going to be able to maintain that level of deliberate choice in embodied, if we succeed in rediscovering this embodied human? Or are we going to have to give up some of that choice to really get a genuine embodied presence?
Good question, actually. I never really thought about that. Well, I mean, embodied humans have a choice on how they present themselves as well. But I mean, obviously, there's much more limited, for sure. But I mean, if you follow many of the ways that we present ourselves online through social networking sites and stuff, they don't actually have that much choice. It is fairly templated. I mean, I have no, you know, Facebook doesn't give me much options for how I present myself in any way that I would feel to be creative or, you know, or expresses of me.
But you could take the example, you might live in a village which didn't approve of the way you might like to present yourself sexually, or you might be in an environment where it was not appropriate to not be religious, have a particular religion, and on the net you could be free and do what you want. So there might be some environments where the embodied physical environment is actually very oppressive.
Oh, yeah.
So was that?
Yeah, no, I mean, and I definitely think that's the case, which is why I wouldn't want to see for example, increased regulation and all the things that are people talking about now. You know, people are talking about a lack of anonymity. I don't want to see that. I mean, I would like to see the internet kept in that way. But I think to do that, we really have to think about ethics in that. You know, we have to, you know, come up with a way where we can reconceptualize how we behave to other people. People who are far away, we, you know, have to, in a sense, try and figure out ways to behave to them more like they're right beside us, right? And that can be a technological matter to a certain extent if you reinsert a bit more humanness in these interactions. Or, you know, and it's also a cultural matter as well. You know, we have to get away from that idea of being spectators in the world. So, I mean, it's, you know, I think it's both. But yeah, I wouldn't, the other option is regulate everything, right? Which is what a lot of people are saying that we should do. And I wouldn't want to see that.
I have a question, like, through these social networking sites, we can communicate with other people. So how would you comment about a new technology that is Internet of Things, in which we can communicate with our things, like my watch? If I forgot my watch in my house, I can communicate with my watch by new technology that is Internet of Things. So how would you comment about this technology?
Well, if I got the gist of your question, I mean, I think, for example, I think this is where a lot of the future in haptics would be quite interesting. Like, to be honest, but just before my talk, I got a text from a friend, right? I mean, she knew I was quite nervous about the talk, and I think rightfully so. And then, you know, there was the reassuring buzz from somebody, like literally 2 minutes before I was introduced, right? And that actually made me feel good. Much better than reading a text message that sort of said good luck. It was kind of like somebody was giving me a hug. Like, I did feel a kind of a sense that somebody cares and somebody's close in this kind of, you know, alien environment to me. And, you know, I mean, you know, and you know, some of the reading, the more sort of computing-oriented reading that I've been doing, I mean, there is work on that kind of haptic sort of things. I mean, you buy things like hug shirts now, for example, which sort of give you a little bit of a squeeze, you know, and that kind of thing. And you can send these sort of remote things, and in a sense, you know, it creates a sense of intimacy. I mean, that's only one example, but I mean, I think it can be done. I'm not, you know, technically going to describe how it can be done, but I mean, yeah, the idea of touch, you know, is very intimate and is very personal and is very human. Why not develop that a bit more in some, you know, in some capacity, so you get more of a sense of the human in these kind of interactions.
But then you'd be kind of saying that just if you went for that argument, then you'd really be saying, well, all you're trying to do is reshape the loops that go from you through the environment back to yourself via other people, and that at the moment you're not closing these loops in a rich enough manner for normal, the way we've evolved to communicate. So I guess that's only part of the argument. The other part is the commitment to the real world, the cost of what you do in the virtual world spilling over into the real world. So there's a number of different issues there over and above the richness of the communication and control technology.
Yeah, I'm just thinking the richness can help.
Okay, well, I think we're coming to the end of this session. One last question I think we've got time for.
Yeah, and when you mentioned Lanier, I was surprised that you didn't mention any of the use of the Media Ecology School that covers Rushkoff and Neil Postman.
I can have a look.
Yeah, it's just, can I just ask, do you own any Facebook stock?
Do I own any Facebook stock? No.
So the reason why I ask is because obviously there's been a bit of a situation with that, and a lot of people have been left holding the baby, and everyone's wondering where the value is, and all the rest of it. And towards the end of your talk, you make a few points about how the qualitative versus quantitative aspect of social networks and how that might be captured, or indeed if it is right to capture it at all. I would go so far as to say that, well, Rushkoff's clearly against that. I mean, if you look at one of the most recent books, Programmed or Deprogrammed, he's actually quite against it. One of the points that he makes is don't sell your friends. Quite a few people, I'm sure, in this lecture theatre have filled out Tesco Club card applications and such, and swapped the cards as to a date of warehousing schemes and so on. But the thing that I wanted to say with the Facebook IPO and ask you was, don't you think that if we don't approach this issue of qualitative versus the quantitative in social networking very carefully, is not a danger that media space is just going to degenerate into a kind of pointless pluralism, you know, an anarchy?
I don't know. I mean, is pluralism necessarily pointless? I mean, I guess. How do you mean in terms of descend into sort of anarchy?
Well, when the tools appear, but the generations who are currently living are not in a position to pick them up and use them. In many ways, I'm following from what Ian had to say about can anyone keep up with millions?
Well, I mean, maybe that's part of the problem, though. I mean, should we be trying to keep up with millions? I mean, you know, information technology is great in the sense that we can keep up with members of our family who are overseas and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, I mean, there's many great things about it. Whether or not, you know, it's reasonable to have 1,082 friends and try and keep in touch with all of them and have that sort of distracted kind of sense of presence about us. I mean, what good does that do anybody in many respects? Well, what good did it do Simone back? You know, I'm not saying that you should only have 5 friends in the world, but at the same time, you know, I think friendship and social interactions are things to be thought about and invested in, perhaps, as opposed to commodified and endlessly expanded. You know, the question is, I suppose, whether or not it does us that much good. It meets some needs. You know, in many respects, you know, it's a classic economic argument, the idea that in an uncertain economic situation, the more sort of, it's called the strength of weak ties argument. The more friends of friends that you have, the more secure of a position you sort of hold in an uncertain environment. But that's a very rational and calculative way of looking at fulfillment of needs, and certainly a very economic one, right? So yeah, you know, if I've got 1 million friends around the world, if I lose my job, it's not the person next to me who's my best friend, who maybe even works in the same place I do, that's going to find me another job because he's going to be in the same boat I am. But it's going to be somebody from another context, a friend of a friend or something like that, who may find me a job. And that's great. But is that person going to provide me emotional support? You know, if I cry out for help on Facebook, are they really going to help me?
This reminds me of something Ronald Reagan said, and that's a recession is when your neighbour loses a job, and a depression is when you lose your own.
yeah, good. Yeah, but I mean, I think that's all I have to say about that, really.
Okay, let's thank Vince again.